So there are sort of two different levels at which we can look at an organization. We can look at it from a macro level and we can look at it from a micro level. Think of like a macro level is if you were to fly an airplane over New York City. What are the things that you would notice? Well, you would notice the system of roads. You would notice traffic patterns. You would notice disbursement of population. At a micro level, if you were walking along the street in New York City, what are the things you would notice? Well, you would notice interactions between people. You would be able to tell the difference between heights and buildings much more easily at a micro level than you could at a macro level. At a macro level, everything's sort of compressed two-dimensional. At a micro level, you can see a bit more in three dimensions. So how does this apply to organizational communication, specifically when we think about the classical approach to organizations? Well, at a macro level, the things that we would look at from a classical approach or a classical lens would be things like bureaucracy and hierarchy. In other words, what does the organizational flow chart look like? Where is power held in an organization? Who talks to who, and who sort of belongs to certain groups within the organization. So if you follow an organizational flow chart, you're going to find that some people are sort of subdivided. Their labor is divided under a specific category. This is a very classical approach to organizations from a macro level. If we can divide people into the right roles, that the organization will be more effective. In a classical approach, we also would see a centralization of power. In other words, those at the top of the flow chart have the most power, and the further down you move from that, or the further out you move from the center of that power, the less power that we see. So the people on the outsides of that flow chart have the least amount of power. So those are some of the things that we would see from a macro lens. From a micro lens, some of the things that we would notice is the relationships and interactions between managers and those that they manage. There's a belief from a classical approach that the individual worker has some expertise, some knowledge of what they do that the manager might not have, because typically what we would see from a classical approach is this strong division of labor, that managers become managers because they're good at managing, not necessarily because they have expertise in the thing that the people under them are doing. So what that means is that the manager is responsible for pulling the most efficient or the most productive way of doing any particular job out of those that they manage. It sets up a system in which the person at the bottom of the organizational chart is valued because they know something, but is also once that value has been taken, once that knowledge has been taken, they lose sort of retaining value in the organization, because once I know what you know, if I'm your manager, once I know what you know, I can teach someone else to do that, and I don't necessarily need to have the expert who may cost my organization more, or who I might have a personality conflict with. So the classical approach to organizations, we can look at it from both a macro and a micro level. There are advantages and there are disadvantages to this approach, but we're going to look throughout the semester at 4 different ways that we can notice communication happening in each of these approaches. The first thing that we can look at is, what does the content of communication look like in this approach? It's task. Task-oriented communication is going to be the most common type of communication or content in communication that you're going to find in a classical approach to organizations. There's going to be very little communication having to do with social or relational maintenance, and there's going to be very little communication that has to do with innovation and creation, because the organization has probably already decided what is the best way of completing each task. So there isn't a need to have conversations about how to innovate or how to do a job better. In fact, that may be seen by those above you as trying to do their job. It may be seen as those below you in the organizational chart as trying to one up everyone else. It may be seen as trying to create more problems and more work for everyone. So there's going to be very little innovation related communication. It's going to be mainly task oriented, and it's going to tend to be vertical. So we can also look at the direction of communication. In a classical approach to organizational communication, communication tends to flow vertically and down. You are not going to see much communication happening horizontally, though you may see a little bit. Most communication would tend to be from my manager to me, and then I would then apply that to the people below me. And that would continue on until we reach the bottom of the organizational chart. There's going to be some communication that goes up in the vertical chain, but it's going to be a different kind of communication. It's going to be less feedback on how the process could improve and more reporting on how the process is being implemented. So it's a different way of thinking about the task. It isn't going to be about improvement as much as it is about implementation. The third thing that we can look at in terms of communication in these approaches is what channel or medium does it tend to take. It could take lots of different forms in a classical approach, but the type that we would see most often, most commonly, would be through written channels. This is because in a classical approach, one of the things that we notice is that people become pretty replaceable in this organizational setting, because once we know the best way of doing something, I can just train someone to do that job. So there isn't much incentive for a person to stay, and there isn't much incentive for me to keep people when I could just train someone else to do that job. So that means that communication needs to exist longer than the people who have the conversation. So written communication is going to be one of the primary ways that we would communicate in a classical approach. There's also a second reason why we would see a lot of written communication, and that has to do with sort of the hierarchical structure that tends to be more legalistic is maybe the wrong word, but if I am constantly beholden to somebody who's constantly beholden to someone else, there is a need for accountability across relationships and across positions. So I'm going to see things like memos in an organization like this. Emails are going to be critical in an organization that sort of functions from a classical approach. The other thing that we're going to see a lot of would be handbooks and guidelines and rules. Those are going to be everywhere. If you work at an organization that tends to function like a classical organization, there's a high hierarchical bureaucracy. It's highly centralized. On your first day, you are probably going to get a binder with your employee handbook, and it is going to be pages on pages on pages of rules that you need to follow and processes that need to be in place for lots of different areas, including your job. The last thing that we can look at in terms of communication from the organizational approach, from the classical organizational approach, would be the style of communication. The style of communication in this approach tends to be very formal. Think back to the content. We don't have social relationship maintenance communication, and we don't have much innovation communication. So there isn't much of a reason to become personal and get to know the people who are around me in this kind of organization. So I talk about things that relate to my job, and I tend to do it from a very formal setting. My interactions, would be less about who I am as a person and who instead be about who I am in the organization. It's important to know that there are very few organizations that function solely through one of these approaches. this is the classical approaches, whether we're looking at theory of management, we're looking at theory of bureaucracy, or theory of scientific management. We are looking at ways of operating, and these are some of the oldest principles that we have in the organizational setting, whether it's business or nonprofit or church or government. These are some of the oldest systems that we have in our sort of modern era of organizing. Sort of post-industrial revolution, as we've moved out of just working for ourselves and now working with and for other people. These theories and principles have sort of guided and shaped the way that those people come together and they organize. Some of these principles have stuck around. Some industries tend to function more out of a classical approach than some of the other approaches we're going to look at this semester. When you think of maybe manufacturing and factory work, you would tend to see some of these classical approaches being implemented. You would also tend to find this approach applied in very manual labor sort of settings. So you would tend to see a position like a custodian or a janitor sort of be treated from this classical approach. We can teach someone to do this job in the most efficient way possible. Therefore, there isn't much need for this individual's personality to impact their job. There isn't much of a need for this person's individual perspective to shape this job. There's a best way to do this job. There's a fastest way to do this job. If we teach this person this job in that way, then we don't really have to worry about how many rooms can be cleaned in a day. We know if they're following the process that we've set out. So there are some industries and there are some positions that would tend to be viewed from this classical lens more often than not. Think through, though, what are some of the positives and what are some of the negatives or the drawbacks that we would see from this approach. With all of these approaches, you're going to be looking for those things. None of these are perfect. None of these are inherently or completely wrong, though, either. So think about that as you're looking at the classical approach.